Hi, welcome to our channel where we share the most intriguing stories. When HOA President Karen Bradshaw declared war on Jack Daniels, a quiet veteran living on the edge of her domain, she underestimated one thing. Jack wouldn't back down. Lies, invasions, and outright destruction, Karen tried it all. But when the dust settled, it wasn't Jack who faced ruin. Jack Daniels had spent most of his life in the midst of chaos. First as a soldier and later as a defense contractor. When he retired, he craved peace. Not just the absence of noise, but the kind of solitude that wraps around you like a warm blanket. The 5-acre plot of land he purchased just outside the city seemed to offer exactly that. Tucked away at the edge of a dense grove of pines, his property was a sanctuary where he could escape the grind of life and finally catch his breath. The house itself, a weathered but sturdy old cottage, spoke to Jack's soul. Its peeling paint and sagging porch weren't flaws to him. They were challenges, echoes of its history waiting to be restored. He spent his days fixing the place up, turning the overgrown backyard into a flourishing garden and the creaky attic into a snug study. Evenings were for long walks on his property, listening to the rustling leaves and the distant hum of nature. But serenity, Jack would soon learn, is often a fleeting thing. His land bordered the pristine, cookie-cutter community of Mapleview Estates. The manicured lawns and identical beige houses looked like something out of a glossy brochure, but to Jack, they reeked of conformity. Still, he figured he could coexist with his new neighbors as long as they stayed on their side of the fence, literally and metaphorically. At the center of Mapleview Estate's power structure was Karen Bradshaw, the iron-fisted president of the HOA. Karen was the sort of person who thrived on order, wielding HOA bylaws like a sword to enforce her vision of suburban perfection. A woman with a perpetually pursed smile and an unrelenting need to control, Karen had spent years building her small empire within Mapleview's boundaries. Jack first crossed her radar a few months after moving in. It started innocuously enough with a polite but formal letter in his mailbox. The letter, stamped with the HOA's logo, informed him that his unkempt lawn, discolored fence, and unauthorized structures violated community standards. Jack chuckled as he read it, then tossed it aside. Surely someone had made a mistake. His property wasn't part of the HOA, and he had the deed to prove it. But the letters didn't stop. A second one came, this time more insistent, then a third. Each one carried escalating language, warning of potential fines and further action. Finally, Jack decided to call the HOA office to straighten things out. Karen herself answered the phone. "Mr. Daniels," she said, her voice sweet but laced with condescension, "Mapleview Estates has recently updated its boundary maps, and your property now falls under our jurisdiction. I'm afraid you'll need to comply with our standards moving forward." Jack's patience wore thin. "Ma'am," he replied, his tone measured, "my property isn't part of Mapleview Estates. It's been independently owned for over a century. Your updated maps don't change the facts." Karen's voice cooled. "I assure you, Mr. Daniels, we have the legal documentation to support our position. I suggest you review the HOA guidelines and address your violations promptly." Jack hung up, shaking his head. He knew he wasn't dealing with reason. He was dealing with power dressed as bureaucracy. What he didn't know was just how far Karen was willing to go to assert her dominion. For now, Jack resolved to stand his ground. He went back to painting his porch, the hum of the crickets keeping him company as the sun dipped below the horizon. Karen Bradshaw was not the kind of person to let a perceived challenge to her authority go unanswered. After her initial attempts to rope Jack Daniels into compliance with the Mapleview Estates HOA fell flat, she decided that diplomacy wasn't the solution. Intimidation was. And so began her carefully orchestrated campaign to paint Jack as a menace to the community. The whispers started small, circulating among the neighbors during morning jogs and evening strolls. "Have you noticed the strange people coming and going from that house?" Karen would say, her tone dripping with faux concern. "And what's with all that clutter in his yard? It doesn't look normal. I just worry about what he might be hiding." Her words planted seeds of doubt, and soon enough, neighbors were passing these rumors along like gospel. For Jack, the signs of this hostility weren't hard to spot. It started with dirty looks and exaggerated sighs from joggers who passed by his property. Then came the litter, empty soda cans, fast food wrappers, and even a broken chair, all strategically dumped near his fence line. Jack knew the trash wasn't accidental. His security cameras confirmed it, catching shadowy figures. Things took an even stranger turn when Jack noticed drones buzzing overhead. At first, he thought they belonged to a tech-savvy neighbor testing out a new gadget. But the regularity with which they appeared and the way they lingered over specific parts of his land told a different story. Reviewing his camera footage, Jack confirmed his suspicions. The drones were operated by Mapleview Estate security personnel. Despite the escalating provocations, Jack remained calm. He meticulously documented every incident, saving the videos and compiling a log of dates and times. He wasn't one to lash out prematurely. Instead, he prepared himself for the inevitable confrontation. Meanwhile, Karen took her crusade to the next level. At the monthly HOA meeting, she gathered residents in the community center and delivered a fiery speech. "Friends," she began, her voice heavy with fabricated concern, "we need to discuss a growing threat to our neighborhood. I've received several anonymous reports about suspicious activity at the Daniels property. It's been alleged that he's harboring illegal substances and possibly engaging in other unlawful activities." The room buzzed with murmurs. Karen paused, savoring the attention before continuing. "I've personally observed irregularities, strange visitors, odd hours, and let's not forget the state of his yard. This isn't just about aesthetics anymore. It's about safety." One or two residents raised hesitant objections, pointing out that Jack seemed like a quiet, private man. But Karen swiftly silenced them. "We can't afford to ignore the warning signs," she insisted. "Our children play in these streets. Do we really want to wait until something terrible happens?" The result was exactly what Karen wanted. By the end of the meeting, she had rallied enough support to justify further action. She announced that the HOA would be increasing security patrols near Jack's property and encouraged residents to report anything they deemed unusual. For Jack, the hostility was no longer subtle. Cars would slow down as they passed his home, drivers craning their necks to peer at his yard. He even caught a group of teenagers climbing over his fence, likely egged on by their parents' newfound disdain for him. Each incident fed the growing fire, turning what should have been a peaceful existence into a brewing storm of tension and paranoia. But Jack wasn't about to fold under pressure. With every rumor, every accusation, and every petty act of sabotage, his resolve only grew stronger. He knew the time would come when Karen's house of lies would collapse, and he was quietly gathering the tools to make it happen. The storm that Karen had been brewing finally broke one early morning. Jack was awoken by the sound of screeching tires and the metallic clang of his front gate being torn from its hinges. Disoriented, he scrambled out of bed, glancing at the monitors connected to his security cameras. What he saw made his blood boil. A team of uniformed HOA security guards, armed with flashlights and clipboards, swarming his property. The guards moved with arrogant purpose, shouting orders to one another as they spread out. One banged on the front door, while another kicked it in before Jack could respond. They stormed inside, barking accusations about illegal substances and claiming they had an anonymous tip about dangerous activities taking place on the premises. Jack hurried to meet them, his voice firm but controlled. "What the hell do you think you're doing? This is private property." The lead guard, a burly man with a smug grin, waved a piece of paper in Jack's face. "Community enforcement," he declared. "We have every right to investigate reports of criminal activity that threaten neighborhood safety." Jack snatched the paper and scanned it. It wasn't a warrant, just a fabricated HOA document signed by none other than Karen Bradshaw. While Jack tried to argue, the guards spread out, ransacking his home under the guise of conducting a search. Doors were kicked open, furniture overturned, and drawers rifled through with no regard for Jack's property or privacy. In the living room, a guard carelessly knocked over a family heirloom, a framed photo of Jack with his late wife during his military service. The glass shattered across the hardwood floor. One guard, standing in Jack's study surrounded by tossed papers and broken belongings, laughed and quipped, "Karen's gonna love this when we bring her the evidence." His words were caught by one of the many cameras Jack had installed, capturing the chaos from every angle. Jack's patience snapped. He grabbed his phone and dialed the police, his voice tight with anger. "I need officers at my property immediately. There's an unlawful invasion in progress." Within minutes, the flashing red and blue lights of police cars lit up the driveway. Officers stepped out, hands on their holsters as they assessed the situation. Jack met them on the porch, visibly shaken but resolute. These people broke into my house. They claim they're investigating, but I have proof this is harassment." The lead officer raised an eyebrow, taking in the destruction inside the home. "You have cameras?" Jack nodded and led the officer to his security system. As the footage played, showing the guards smashing through his gate and vandalizing his home, the officer's expression hardened. Karen arrived shortly after, her face a mask of mock concern. "Officers, thank goodness you're here. I'm Karen Bradshaw, president of the HOA. We've been monitoring this property for months, and I can assure you," the officer cut her off. "Ma'am, this isn't an HOA matter. This is a criminal trespass and property damage investigation." Karen's composure cracked for a moment, but she quickly recovered, flashing her most disingenuous smile. "We were only acting in the interest of the community. We received a tip." Jack interrupted, his voice icy. "You mean the anonymous tip you manufactured? Your goons destroyed my home, Karen. You're not a hero, you're a criminal." The officer, clearly unimpressed with Karen's explanations, gestured for her to step aside as he and his team began taking statements. No illegal substances were found, of course, and the guards' actions were revealed as an egregious abuse of power. Karen's desperate attempts to frame Jack had backfired spectacularly, and she was about to face the full weight of the law. For Jack, the sight of her being forced to answer for her actions was a small but satisfying first step toward justice. As the police began processing the chaos at Jack Daniels' property, it became clear that this wasn't going to end with a simple apology. The security guards were detained for questioning, but all eyes turned to Karen Bradshaw, who arrived in a whirlwind of indignation. Standing in her tailored blazer, she tried to play the part of the concerned leader who had simply been misunderstood. "This is all a mistake," Karen protested as officers approached her with handcuffs. "I was only acting in the best interest of the community. These accusations are absurd." The lead officer wasn't swayed. "Ma'am, we have evidence that you organized and authorized this unlawful invasion, filed a false police report, and presented fabricated documents. You're under arrest for criminal trespass, document forgery, and defamation." Karen's confidence faltered as the cuffs clicked around her wrists, but she quickly recovered, her voice rising in pitch. "This is a misunderstanding. I was trying to protect my neighbors. You don't know the whole story." Her pleas fell on deaf ears as she was escorted to the patrol car. Jack watched from his porch, arms crossed. For the first time in months, he felt a sense of vindication. Karen's reign of terror was finally being dismantled. As the investigation unfolded, the true extent of Karen's abuse of power came to light. Detectives pored over HOA records and interviewed residents, uncovering a pattern of manipulation and deceit that spanned years. Karen had been fabricating violations to extract fines, forging documents to annex properties into the HOA's jurisdiction, and bullying anyone who dared to challenge her authority. One elderly couple recounted how Karen had tried to force them to sell their home under the threat of constant fines for unauthorized gardening. Another neighbor revealed that she had been charged thousands of dollars for unapproved holiday decorations that didn't even exist. Each story painted a clearer picture of a woman who had turned a neighborhood association into her personal fiefdom. Jack's attorney, a sharp and tenacious advocate named Evelyn Carter, built a rock-solid case against Karen. Armed with security footage, eyewitness accounts, and a litany of HOA records showing Karen's fraudulent activity, Evelyn prepared to expose Karen's schemes in court. When the trial began, Karen tried to maintain her composed facade, but the weight of evidence was overwhelming. Evelyn presented the damning footage of the guards breaking into Jack's property, Karen's falsified maps claiming his land as part of Mapleview Estates, and a series of emails where Karen explicitly directed her security team to handle Jack. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Evelyn concluded in her opening statement, "this case is not just about one man's property rights. It's about standing up to unchecked power and holding those who abuse it accountable." Karen's defense team attempted to spin her actions as a series of unfortunate misunderstandings, but even they struggled to keep a straight face as witness after witness testified against her. Former HOA board members revealed that Karen had manipulated them into approving her schemes, while several residents described the financial and emotional toll of her reign. By the time Jack took the stand, the courtroom was riveted. He calmly recounted the months of harassment, the destruction of his property, and the constant cloud of suspicion Karen had cast over his life. "I moved here for peace and quiet," he said. What I got was a war I didn't start, but one I refused to lose. The trial's climax came when Karen herself was forced to testify. Under cross-examination, Evelyn dismantled her defense, exposing lie after lie. Karen's bravado crumbled, and for the first time she appeared truly defeated. The courtroom was electric with anticipation as the judge prepared to deliver the verdict. Jack sat quietly in the gallery, his calm demeanor masking the whirlwind of emotions inside. Across the room, Karen Bradshaw looked pale and diminished, her once imperious posture replaced by nervous fidgeting. Her carefully constructed facade had crumbled under the weight of damning evidence. And now, the moment of reckoning had arrived. The judge's voice cut through the tension like a blade. Ms. Bradshaw, this court finds you guilty on all counts, including forgery of documents, filing a false police report, and orchestrating an unlawful invasion of private property. Your actions were deliberate, malicious, and caused significant harm, both financial and emotional, to Mr. Daniels and others in your community. Karen visibly flinched but remained silent. The judge continued, "You are hereby sentenced to 3 years in state prison and ordered to pay restitution to Mr. Daniels for the damage to his property and emotional distress. Furthermore, this court recommends a thorough audit of Mapleview Estates HOA under the oversight of an independent investigator." A collective murmur rippled through the courtroom as Karen was led away in handcuffs. Outside, reporters clamored for statements, but Jack simply offered a nod of quiet satisfaction. Justice had been served, and Karen would finally face the consequences of her actions. Back in Mapleview Estates, the fallout was swift and transformative. Residents, many of whom had blindly supported Karen, were outraged to learn the extent of her abuses. An emergency HOA meeting was called, and the remaining board members voted unanimously to remove her from her position. In her place, the HOA brought in an independent auditor to review finances and governance, uncovering years of mismanagement and misuse of funds. The neighborhood began to heal. Formerly isolated residents started working together to draft new bylaws, ensuring greater transparency and fairness. Jack, once vilified, became a local hero, his resilience inspiring others to stand up for their rights. For Jack, the ordeal was finally over. Sitting on his repaired porch, he watched the sun dip below the horizon, feeling a profound sense of peace. The chaos Karen had brought into his life was gone, replaced by a newfound respect from his neighbors and the knowledge that he had stood firm in the face of injustice. Months after the trial, Jack Daniels' life had returned to the quiet normalcy he had long craved. His home, once invaded and wrecked by Karen Bradshaw's minions, now stood restored to its former charm. The broken doors were replaced, the shattered heirlooms repaired, and the memories of chaos had been slowly erased by the rhythmic hum of his daily life. In the mornings, Jack tended to his thriving garden, now free from prying drones and judgmental stares. Evenings were spent on his porch, savoring the tranquil rustle of leaves and the knowledge that peace was finally his to keep. Surprisingly, many neighbors who had once stood silently by Karen's side came forward to apologize. "We didn't know the full story, Jack," one elderly man admitted sheepishly. Another neighbor, a young mother, offered to help repair Jack's fence, her children in tow, as a gesture of goodwill. Their sincerity helped mend the divide that Karen's lies had created, and Jack found himself surrounded not by enemies, but by a growing sense of community. Far from Mapleview Estates, Karen sat in a sterile, gray-walled prison cell. The hum of fluorescent lights and the clang of distant bars punctuated her isolation. Stripped of her power and the control she had wielded like a weapon, she had nothing left but her thoughts. At first, she clung to her indignation, blaming the system, Jack, and even her former allies for her downfall. But as the weeks passed, reality crept in. Her empire of manipulation was gone, and the neighborhood she had once ruled with an iron fist had moved on without her. No one sent letters. No one visited. She was simply forgotten. Meanwhile, Mapleview Estates experienced a renaissance. Under new leadership, the HOA underwent sweeping reforms. The strict, punitive bylaws Karen had championed were replaced with policies designed to foster trust and collaboration. For the first time in years, the community felt like a true neighborhood. To celebrate their progress, the residents organized a block party, complete with food, music, and games. Jack was invited as the guest of honor, As Jack arrived, he was greeted with cheers and handshakes. The air buzzed with laughter and the clink of glasses. Parents introduced their children to the man who had stood up to injustice, and neighbors shared stories of how they had also learned to assert their rights in the wake of Karen's downfall. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the sounds of the celebration faded, Jack found himself back on his porch. The quiet was no longer heavy with tension, but filled with a profound sense of accomplishment. He gazed out at his land, the boundaries of which he had fought so hard to protect. It's worth standing up for the truth, he thought, even when it feels like the world is against you. This is my land, my home, and no one has the right to take that away. With that, Jack leaned back in his chair, letting the weight of the past lift as the stars began to dot the night sky. He had fought, endured, and won. Peace, at last, was his.